I welcome everyone. Good morning. My name is Péter Wagner. I'm a senior research fellow at the Institute for Foreign Affairs and Trade. And today we have an event called Reflections on Afghanistan, conversation with Ambassador Tadamichi Yamamoto. Ambassador, welcome in Hungary. Welcome on this event. First, our director, Márton Ugrósdy, will give a short welcome speech, and then we will move on to Ambassador Yamamoto, who will give us his reflections on Afghanistan. Please, Mr. Ugrósdy.
Thank you, Peter, and greetings to everybody. Good morning in Hungary and good afternoon in Japan. It's a great pleasure for us today to host Ambassador Yamamoto Tadamichi, who used to serve in Afghanistan for almost 5.5 years between 2016 and 2020. And he brings to the table today an enormous wealth of knowledge and experience. He has spent his entire career in the Japanese Foreign Service. Earlier, he graduated from the Tokyo Institute of Technology and the University of Oxford in the UK. So right from the beginning, he was very well suited to all the tasks that he has been tasked with later on. And among his many assignments over the years, he also served as the Japanese ambassador to Hungary at a certain point of his career. So obviously there's an additional connection between us today. And it's great to have you, Ambassador, back, at least virtually. Obviously, the pandemic doesn't allow for these events to be held in person, but we do hope that very soon we will be able to welcome you here in Budapest. The topic today, I think, is very relevant, not only because the world is watching at what's happening in Afghanistan and what the future will be with the new government, which comes from with a background in the Taliban movement, but also because so many challenges are emerging, ranging from migration to drug trafficking and all these kind of illicit activities, which are expected to be back. But the problem here is that we do not know that what's going to happen. And I think we are very grateful for both of you, with the ambassador and with Péter, that you are here and we're having this conversation, because having information from the ground, drawing on the enormous amount of personal experience and knowledge that both of you represent here today will help us understand a little bit more that what can we expect. And I think if we look at what happened back in August this year, when the entire country fell to the Taliban in a matter of a few days, I may say, there were wild predictions in the international press that what might happen, and not a lot of that eventually came true. So we're really curious to see and listen to you, to both of you, at what is your assessment of the current situation and what we should prepare ourselves and how we can tackle those problems as the international community, but also as individual countries that might emerge from the situation on the ground. And with that, I would like to close my opening remarks. Thank you once again, Ambassador, for being with us today. And Péter, I'll give it back to you to moderate the discussion today. And I would also like to thank the audience for logging in this morning to follow this conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Márton. Before I pass the floor to Ambassador Yamamoto, I will give just a few more information on his career, diplomatic career. He was an ambassador in charge of assistance to Afghanistan and Pakistan in 2010. And from 2014, he became the Deputy Special Representative of the Secretary General of the UN for Afghanistan. So before he became the Special Representative for Afghanistan for 5 years, he had already has engagement with Afghanistan. Since he has this so-called front seat among the Afghanistan watchers regularly negotiating with the Afghan government and the Taliban leadership and the United Nations Security Council, I think Ambassador Yamamoto really has this special view on the developments in Afghanistan. First, Ambassador Yamamoto will give us a presentation about the failures and the achievements of the past 20 years with a special focus on the international assistance, on the international community. And then we will move on the Q&A part of our webinar where the audience will have the opportunity to ask questions. Having said that, Ambassador Yamamoto, the floor is yours. Please upload your presentation and then I will try to share it with the audience.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Ugrósdy, am I pronouncing it right? And also Peter for inviting me to be part of this interesting and important seminar. I'd like to, in my presentation, I would like to focus more on the efforts, international efforts that had been put into Afghanistan over the years, and why it did not really work out so well. Or I'll, of course, to do justice to the international efforts, talk about some of the achievements, but I think there's a lot of lessons to be learned from what had happened in Afghanistan. I would touch upon very lightly on the current issues and what awaits for us for the future, but I think we can discuss that after my presentation, and I look forward to that. Let me turn to the PowerPoint. Can you let me control the sharing of the...
Yeah, I do it now.
Yeah,
and,
great. Right. Do you think I'd be able to control it, or you would?
Just give me a second. It's supposed to work.
Yeah.
Okay. But
I think my ability, yeah, okay. My ability to actually move, yeah, great. Do you think you'd let me handle the control of the PowerPoint by letting me to, if you could? If not, I would ask you to do it.
Okay, thank you.
But there's something that I might want to share later. That's why I said, I thought perhaps if I could control it myself, it's better. But let me first of all talk about the reasons or the factors which contributed to the unexpectedly rapid fall of the Ghani administration on the 15th of August. I think we all remember that when the US-Taliban agreement had been reached on 28th of February 2020, the US was to withdraw in 15 months, which was in May. But of course, that was extended by President Biden, that they would withdraw from country on the 30 at the end of August. But when the US administration, when the Ambassador Harilzad started talking to Taliban, the purpose was simply not withdrawal. There were sort of four issues which had to be addressed. One was to ensure that Afghanistan would not be used for terrorist purposes, that it will not be a hotbed for terrorism again. The second issue was the withdrawal of foreign troops, particularly the US troops. Third issue was the start of peace talks between the Taliban and the Republic side. And the fourth topic was the ceasefire. Now, the negotiation between the US and the Taliban took turns, and for the first two, they had been able to agree on some detail, which is about ensuring that Afghanistan territory shall not be used for the purpose of terrorism, and a lot of obligation had to be on the Taliban side, and the other was the withdrawal of the US troops. But for the last two, the start of peace talks and the ceasefire, the things did not go as originally people had hoped and the US had hoped. And because of that, I think you would recall that the government of Afghanistan and the President Ghani was not happy and was dissatisfied with the achievements through the US Taliban talks. But nevertheless, the talks between the Taliban and the Republic sides was to start actually immediately, but that didn't take place, if you remember, because Taliban and the US side had agreed on the issue of prisoner release or prisoner exchanges before the talks could actually begin, and that took 6 months. And instead of the peace talks starting in March of 2020, it actually started in September of 2020, 6 months later. However, the US withdrawal actually took place according to the original timeline. Again, on this one, the Afghan government was not very happy. Now, the withdrawal of the US forces was predicated on two things. One was the progress of the peace talks between the Taliban and the Afghan government. And the other was the ability of the Afghan forces to fight the Taliban to maintain a stalemate. So the thinking was that while the Taliban was checked by the Afghan forces, the peace talks would actually come to some sort of conclusion and would lead to reconciliation between Taliban and the rest of the Afghan society. It did not take place, as you know. Now, one of the factors why the peace talks did not go well was that the Republic side did not have a strong enough or monolithic position to deal with the Taliban. And I think you all know that the presidential elections in 14 and actually the latest one in 19 were deeply divisive. And on the Republic side, the society was politically divided and they could not come together. In fact, even the peace negotiating team to talk with Taliban could not be formed for some time, and lots of international pressure, including that from the United Nations and the US, had to be exerted before they can actually form even a negotiating team. And I think we all know that without the strong will of the two conflicting parties, the peace process would not move forward. But seeing this kind of deeply divided situation on the Republic side, it is easy to imagine that the Taliban did not feel compelled to commit itself to negotiating with the Republic side to reach a solution to the conflict. And I remember really well, I used to negotiate with the Taliban almost every month, particularly towards the end of my assignment, but at least once, 2 months, even earlier, in order to bring the Taliban to come and talk to the Republic side. And they had never said that there will not be a military solution to the conflict. They had said, certainly very, very sort of forcefully, that they would prefer that it's good to have a negotiated settlement, but they never committed itself to abandon a possibility of settlement through military means. And I think this was known not just to the United Nations, but to everybody, including the United States. The other reason which made the peace talks not so easy for the Republic side was the lack of support of the people. You really do need the support of ordinary citizens to reinforce your positions for negotiation. But the serious poverty among the Afghan society, even after 20 years of assistance, really undermined the people's trust and support for the government. Then militarily, again, the Afghan forces unfortunately lack the abilities to fight it out on their own. For military exercise to be successful, you need 3 types of abilities. One is the fighting ability, but then there are two others, the planning ability and logistics. And I was told by the successive commanders of US forces in Afghanistan that the abilities of Afghan forces to fight had really grown, and special forces were really of international standard. But the ability to plan the fighting and to do the logistics was not up to the standard, and that they actually required the presence of the NATO or American soldiers and officers to be able to do it right. It's a pity because apparently they actually knew, or technically they had the ability, but probably they lacked the confidence, because at one time I was told that even if the American officer did not do anything, just their presence would have made it possible for the Afghans to come together and do the planning and for fighting and logistics. So it is a pity that the situation was not brought to the needed level at the time of the departure of US forces. And the fifth element was the Taliban's increased legitimacy and morale. The mere fact of Taliban's negotiating with the United States had increased its international legitimacy. But because of that, there was a sort of rush of members of international community to talk to Taliban, not to sort of be left behind. And so not only Russia hosted the meeting between Taliban and the Afghan side in so-called Moscow format 3 times. There are other countries like EU and other European countries, Germany, France, Norway, Britain, who had rushed to Doha, Qatar to meet with the Taliban. And not only they, but then the countries like Indonesia and others also from Central Asia, for instance, had tried to talk to Taliban. And this has really increased its legitimacy. They were invited to the capitals, to China, to Jakarta, to Tashkent and other places. And naturally, this has raised the morale of Taliban. There were the sort of forces upcoming, whereas the Republic, one could see, was in disarray, particularly among the political leaders. And because the fighting was also going really relatively well, even though there were some sort of stalemate while the international forces were there, the morale on the Taliban side was high. And then when the American forces started mounted the real withdrawal from May this year, then they had a good strategy of attacking the Afghan forces from the north. This meant, and they were successful, and this meant that north, which was the only part which was not under control of Taliban in the 90s, had fallen. And one could easily imagine that the whole country would fall to the Taliban. And that led to the very rapid collapse of the Republic side. If you could go to the next page. But no, that's the reason for one of, well, those are the factors which contributed to the rapid fall. But I think we should remember, go back to the original point and remember why we got involved in Afghanistan. It was after 9/11 in 2001, and the United Nations sanctioned the moves of international community to attack the country and to drive Taliban out. But the purpose was quite clear. The purpose was never to make Afghanistan a hotbed for terrorism. That was it. But in order to avoid to ensure that Afghanistan does not become hotbed, one needs to stabilize the country, because instability would become the breeding ground for terrorism. So efforts were made to stabilize the country in the following 4 areas: political area, governance, meaning administration and development, and also in the social ethics, if you like, or the human rights and other the fundamental values which define the way the society is being run. But if you just really sort of look at it with a cool-headedness, what is really necessary for independence of Afghanistan? Is it what the international community has said in those 4 areas, just as I have described, or are they different? And I think that's the question that we should really ask for the future, when we have to try again to help the peace process or to the reconstruction of the country. Now, one thing that I think one should realize is, okay, so what we tried to do as the international community was to really bring democracy and freedom based on the Western style of governance and democratic ideas. But was Afghanistan really ready for such such a system? It is an ethnically diverse country where the ethnic leaders have their in their own right, have respect of their own people, and they really are not going to obey the other leaders of other ethnicities. There has to be compromise and arrangement in order for them to agree on the type of political institutional arrangements and power distribution that would be necessary. And also, because of the very difficult geographical terrain, the country is very independent locally, and in the localities, the community leaders and regional leaders had the sway, and there were already very much established political power structure, and the imposition of newly centralized network of governance to localities meant that new governor, who may not have any kind of a political background in the region, may actually disrupt the existing power structure and be resisted by the resident political leaders. In fact, this did happen. There were a couple of occasions, or even more occasions, when the new governor's appointment was resisted by force by the regional leaders, and there were sometimes gun battles, and sometimes the appointment had to be reversed. And also, even the elections. During the time of President Karzai, because President Karzai was much more, what shall I say, understanding of the local realities, I think even when he won the elections, I think he tried to woo the political leaders from different ethnicities and localities and different groups, and managed to do it, try to manage it in a more traditional way. Now, President Ghani was much more Western in thinking, and he had tried to implement the Western type of electoral system and the arrangement, which is a winner take all, so to speak, in 2014 and 2019. And this led to, in 2014, almost a civil war. And that led to the creation or intervention by the United States government. Secretary of State Kerry went to overnight to mediate. and created national unity government, which was a totally extra constitutional arrangement, nothing to do with the elections. Similarly, in 2019, when I was there, the presidential elections was conducted technically well, according to our experts. If you look at the technical side, it's really one of the well-conducted elections in developing country, but the actual outcome was not accepted because accepting defeat means losing political power. And so there were two, if you remember, inaugurations of president at the same time. So the candidates were not ready to accept defeat and concede. And even the populace had seen this. So when the elections first started in 2004, the turnout was like 65%. But in 19, turnout was only 18.8% of registered voters, which is in fact less than 10% of eligible voters. So President Ghani was elected on the basis of about 5% of eligible voters. Now, in terms of, I would try to rush through because of the limited time. But in terms of governance, much has been achieved. This is where, for instance, the United Nations were given lots of mandate to implement, nurture the capacities of Afghan people and to run the ministries and to ensure that the administration with necessary needs of people had been properly implemented. In terms of education, as you can see, a lot of achievement has been made. Girls were educated, and even universities were receiving many women in, for instance, University in Herat. More women students than men. Now, welfare again, a lot had been done. Could we go next page? Could we go to next page? Yes. Now, in terms of development assistance, this is another area that I think when we look to future peace process or future nation building after peace, is something that we should look back with some lessons. In 2001 or 2, actually, after Bonn, we had the ministerial meeting in Tokyo, and a large amount of money was committed. And I think countries really rushed to help the Afghanistan, and huge amount of money was poured in. Over the 20 years, it's $150 billion. It's an enormous amount of money. And given the kind of state of development of Afghanistan, this exceeded the absorption capacity of the country. And lots of cash could not be absorbed into the projects and simply went into the pocket or the suitcases and led to the corruption. And this is actually well studied by the SIGA, which is the independent commission of the US government, which looked into the US assistance into Afghanistan and how that turned into very unfortunately a corrupt situation in Afghanistan. So this is not my saying or my finding, but it's the finding of the US government's independent commission. Then something that I think we should also really look at, which is why we still have over 60% of people below the poverty line when so much money has been poured in. And even if you distributed this money just as a cash to all these people, they might be better off. So why? You know, it's very difficult to know. And I think a lot of, I think introspection or review has to go in to what is it that we were not able to do well enough to eradicate poverty. You know, the economic growth rate at the early stages, like 30% a year, and maybe throughout the Karzai period, double-digit growth. But those were perhaps only money which went in to help the international activities, perhaps. We don't know, but many people say so. I think a lot of work and some research should be made into this. And at the end of it, it helped the population growth because people were able to have more children and the population growth became over 3%. But after the withdrawal of international forces at the end of 2014, the money inflow dropped dramatically and the economic growth rate became around 1.5%. This meant that the population grew faster than the economy, and therefore the poverty per capita increased. So these are the kind of things I think we really need to look at. Now, in terms of the more ethical and value-oriented efforts of international community, I think a lot has been done. In terms of human rights, the United Nations took care to ensure the civilian casualties are going to be lessened, and we worked with both the Afghan military, the international military, and the Taliban to point out what were the things which had led to the increase in civilian casualties. And all three entities had made some sort of efforts to try to reduce the civilian casualties. Even Taliban did that. We had major row with all the three entities, including the United States and the Afghan government and the Taliban, to point to their sort of mistaken activity, military activities in this regard. Now, women's empowerment and protection, this is something that is really a central focus now internationally. But while the international efforts are being made, the actual numbers is not bad. For instance, 27% of parliamentarians were women. There were ministers, deputy ministers, director generals who were women and capable. Heads of Afghan Independent Afghan Human Rights Commission was women consecutively. And so a lot has been done. And even when I go to the provinces, every time I went, I met with women activists and also men who from the government, from the local government, to ensure that women's empowerment and protection is promoted. And even in the most conservative areas, it has become, shall I say, possible to talk about this issue in public. It used to be taboo, but it no longer was taboo at the end of it, although not much has been achieved in some of the more conservative areas. Now, rule of law. Anti-corruption was something which undermined the health of the society and which had actually deprived Afghan government of the support of the people. Now, I began to understand that. So the moment I became a SNSG, because I began to understand that while I was deputy, I took up the issue of anti-corruption as a new area of work for the United Nations and decided to publish annual report on anti-corruption against the opposition from the headquarters, because headquarters opposed it because research into anti-corruption meant that you have to perhaps look at some of the more violent people, and that the staff who might be investigating this could be in danger of his or her life. But I had promised that we won't go into individual investigation of individuals, but we'll look at the institutional arrangements and law and the practice. And we have published this report consecutively, which had been useful. But unfortunately, this is an area that had only a limited progress, even though not only the United Nations, but particularly the United Kingdom and the EU were very, very serious in trying to nail this down. In fact, how important this is seen by one episode, which I can cite to you. When I decided that the United Nations put this as one of the top priorities of our work, 7 Afghan workers at the United Nations took an appointment with me and came to see me. I did not know what it was about. They came not only from Kabul, but also from provinces, because we have 12 offices in the country. And when they came, they said, thank you. So I said, why? And they said, thank you for taking up the anti-corruption as the top priority of the United Nations. This is the first time that the United Nations is now working for the people of Afghanistan, not for the government of Afghanistan. I was actually stunned because I didn't expect such a response from our own staff, but this is how Afghan people felt. And I think this is one of the sort of real disease which had bit into the society. Now, freedom of media, again, we had great achievement. It's the top in South and Central Asia above India, but this is the kind of thing which can be reversed easily. If you could go to the next one. So looking back, what are the problems? There was an effort to plant and realize this type of democracy from the outset. Was it the correct judgment? Was there not an incremental approach which would have accommodated the local realities and made it easier for more traditional people to accept as a gradual change, even though we may have this Western type of democracy as a final objective? Was a centrally powerful presidential system the right modality or political system in a country where regions are so independent? Afghanistan had been a monarchy for many, many years, as you may know. And the monarch is a very loose affiliation. People have allegiance and loyalty to monarch, but could still maintain independence locally. But I think the idea of monarchy, which actually the one in 2001, some Japanese felt was perhaps a better idea than presidency, had been rejected by the international community then. They have adopted in Bonn this new presidential system with powerful president was adopted. It's a question that I think we really need to think to see what type of democratic system should be adopted in the country that we're trying to help. And also in 2002 and 2009, when Taliban was still very weak, they had approached the international community and asked if they could join the reconciliation process. The international community said, no, you are over, you are finished. And so they did not accept Taliban, but this was, of course, had a very difficult consequences, as we know. Was it a mistake? We don't know. Then I talked about elections. In order for the elections to be acceptable, winner-take-all system may not be the right way. Winner-take-all is okay in a country like Britain, where the opposition, even if they lost, will become loyal opposition of Her Majesty, or in the United States, where there's a very strong parliament, where usually the losing side gains the majority and the check and balance works. But perhaps when in democracy is still in developing, we need some other arrangements. If you could go to the next slide. Now, economic development, I think I already spoke, so I wouldn't go again into the sort of same thing, but maybe we need a more sober approach than putting huge amount of money into the country at once. And also, I think this is a very important thing. The second point is the role of regional countries. Those are the countries which actually work with Afghanistan in the regional network of economic activities. Could we not have really ask them to play even larger part. Later on, Kazakhstan tried to do that. When in 2018, when I was SSG, Kazakhstan hosted a meeting in Security Council because it was a Security Council member, and tried to see what the regional countries could do in collaboration with the international community. It's the kind of thing perhaps we could really look at, than to impose the ideals into the country which is starting on its own path. Then I talked about poverty reduction. The human rights I've already talked about, and rule of law too. So shall we go to the next one? Those are actually what I've spoke about is perhaps for other countries, for the lesson learned to be applied to other countries, not for Afghanistan. So for the Afghanistan future, I think we should look, what I've spoke up until now is perhaps not particularly useful. But for the Afghanistan, we all know the problems. The over 22 billion people under poverty line is something which we cannot accept or tolerate. You know how cold Afghanistan gets during winter. It's below freezing. And I've been to the camps for IDPs, displaced people. You know, it's just a sort of bare land. And you have a sort of tent, sort of cloth tent over it. It's not even good enough to shut out the cold. When you have men, the men dig into the ground. They dig about 1 meter deep and then put cloth tent over it. So when you have some heating inside, you could keep some heat inside the tent. But where only women, the family members, they don't have the strength to dig into the ground, and it is really, really cold. And we see that UNDP has said that if nothing is done, 97% of the population would be below poverty line by the summer of next year. And WHO is warning us that 1 million child could die during the winter. We have to do something, and I think international effort is being made, but despite the appeal, only about just over 40% of appeal has been met. But the fundamental problem is that of the sanctions. Because of the sanctions that is imposed by the United States by law, the bank account of Afghan government is frozen in the United States with close to $10 billion. And because of that, the private banking sector is not working in Afghanistan either. And so the shortage of cash is really choking the economy. Now, even in the United States, there are people who are saying that to choke the economy should be removed from the sanctions. I agree with them. There has to be some way of letting the cash flow into the country so that the economy could start running and help eradicate the poverty. I think it's wrong to punish the Afghan people simply because of Taliban victory. Of course, the Taliban needs to ensure that terrorist activities in Afghanistan is not coming back. The ISIS activity is stronger again, and although Taliban and ISIS are fighting against each other, and Taliban has a strong association with Al-Qaeda, so we hope that Taliban will not become too desperate to abandon its efforts. It has to earn to be recognized internationally. And to do that, it has to ensure that terrorist activities are certainly not coming back. And then internally, it has to ensure that the government will be inclusive and that women's rights are somehow respected. But of course, I think it's difficult to define what the inclusive government is, because it's totally inclusive, it's national unity government. And even in Western world, there's no country which has national unity government, really. So you really have to have some kind of opposition and government. So it's a question of how to ensure that the all political actors can somehow have input into the political system. And I think perhaps the international community can give some sort of hint and advice as to what could be done, except rather than to simply say that you have to form a national unity government with all the political leaders in the same government. It is, to me, doesn't seem to be practical. Women's rights, again, if you look at the countries in the region, which country has the total women's right implemented? Saudi Arabia, Iran, Pakistan? You must be joking. So what is it that the international communities are asking? I think that has to be defined. And I think we saw that decision has made by the Credential Committee in the United Nations to defer who has the seat in the United Nations, which is, I think, to be expected given the kind of political situation. The diplomatic community has very limited number of presence in Kabul. UN is there, but only the regional countries and Russia and China are there. And my fear is that this may be seen as a kind of Western democracy versus the rest. And that is not a good demarcation. I think that there has to be a better, more coordinated approach internationally to work with the Taliban. We should probably come up with a roadmap to ask Taliban to implement certain things for normalization of relationship with the Taliban and the diplomatic presence, including that of the Western countries, should be brought back on conditional basis. We go to the next slide. So in concluding, I quote the word of Kissinger, who wrote on 25th of August, just after the fall of Kabul government, that maybe we neglected creating conceivable alternative achievable objectives rather than to set a very high hurdle to attain the ideal immediately. And I think that that is quite a wise statement. And I left that question because Hungary had gone through a difficult period of transition from a socialist country into Western type of democracy. And I think you must know better than most other people that transition requires respect of regional and local realities. Thank you.
Thank you for your reflections, Ambassador Yamamoto. I think it was very critical and honest. In a way, you view Afghanistan and the international community's approach towards Afghanistan. And I would like to open the floor for questions. I would suggest to those who would like to ask questions, write down in the chat section, and then we can see the questions. Ambassador Yamamoto will even see it as well. And since then we have the first questions, I would like to ask your memories about negotiating with the Taliban. You mentioned that you met them almost regularly. And well, after taking Kabul in 2021 August, the international public were quite critical in believing the Taliban promises. What is your view? How do you see them? What was your impressions talking with the Taliban?
Yes, I think I mentioned to you that Taliban had become fairly sophisticated, because I think when they were ousted back in 2001, they were really not quite understanding of the realities of the international community. I think particularly those in the political commission had studied the realities of international situation. And I think they understand that they need to improve on themselves to be able to be accepted by the international community. But there are but, I'm afraid. There are two buts. One is that is only the International Political Commission. They had contact with us and the many countries at high levels and from both Western world and the region and China and Russia. And so they know that they have to change. These are people like Mr. Barada, Mr. Snekzai, Mr. Motaki, and these people. But unfortunately, the war was won by military means. There was an effort towards the end to try to have a negotiated settlement, even though Taliban was in ascendancy militarily. And what Ambassador Harilzad of the United States was trying to do towards the end was to try to do just that. But that didn't materialize because of the very rapid progress of the Taliban, and also because of the collapse of the Ghani government, which had left, according to what I hear, sort of ascendancy of the military commission in the internal struggle. You have heard that the Murabalada was beaten in the palace and had to go to Kandahar, etc., etc. Now, I don't know how much of that is true, but it certainly seems true that politically they are not completely ready, and it's very difficult for them to understand, particularly some of the requirements from the international community of inclusiveness, which I've already made some criticisms about. So this is one. So even though they understand the political need to change, I think there has to be planned dialogue between the international community and the Taliban so that they understand what they actually have to do, which is achievable, as Kissinger says. And the second thing is that even Taliban, I'm sure you all know, were not ready to take over so quickly. So they are at a loss. And I think that at the very beginning, the instructions were not really well heeded to. And there had been many wrongdoings and also killings of former Afghan soldiers, government soldiers, which is very unfortunate. And so it will take a little more time. But I think people who had very close talks with Taliban, I'm talking not about Pakistan, but about people in Qatar, they seem to feel that Taliban could be brought into understanding the international logic, although it might take time. And so I think I repeat my suggestion that there has to be some kind of roadmap which should be drawn by the international community to negotiate with the Taliban. And when I say international community, it should include both the Western countries and also in the region. So this is one.
Thank you. I have a few more questions, but now I found two questions in the chat section, and I would start with the second one, which reflect on Japanese interest in the region. What do you think about the growing Chinese presence in Afghanistan, and how will this affect Japanese and their allies' interests?
My experience, I have a lot of dealing with China, actually, because I was in charge of United States, and also I was in South Korea and was dealing with North Korean issues, whereby China played a large role. I also worked on Cambodia and had meetings with the Chinese in Beijing. And then also I had many dealing with Chinese in Kabul. And looking at China from Kabul and looking at China from Tokyo, you see two different type of entities. When you look at China from Tokyo, it looks much more, what shall I say, threatening. But when you look at China from Kabul, it looks much more constructive. So I think Japan needs to understand that China has its own, of course, diplomatic priorities, and that also in terms of its security requirements, situation in Northeast Asia is much more critical and much more confrontational. But in other parts of the world, there are rooms for cooperation. And actually, I was suggesting to my government, to the Japanese government, when I was still in with the United Nations, that Japan should try to see if they can't work together somehow, even on small projects in Afghanistan, because the interests are shared and it didn't materialize. Now, but I think there is a genuine concern, not among professional diplomats, but among academics, Japanese academics, that the increased presence or the relative increase in the presence of China because of the withdrawal of the United States could mean that the Japanese interest, which is very large in Central Asia and the South Asia, could come into conflict with China. But I personally don't think so. I really think that the region is so diversified. The interests of both countries are not critical to their survival, that there is a lot of room for cooperation and things could be worked out.
There was a kind of, I don't know if I can call it wishful thinking after the fall of Taliban, that in the future or in the near future, Afghanistan could be a place for great powers when they could cooperate instead of compete.
Yes,
Russia,
I
China,
quite agree.
and United States. This is what you just mentioned here is something similar to that. Since the needs of Afghanistan, it could lead us. It could lead to this nation, including Japan as well, to be more cooperative for the sake of the Afghan people.
Right.
I see another new message. Which country do you think will the first to recognize the Taliban? If you have any estimate?
Tough one. I would say that it will be one of the regional countries. I think Saudi Arabia, UAE, who used to recognize Taliban. Pakistan also used to recognize Taliban in the 90s, but I think Pakistan would be much more careful this time because they are seen as one of the culprits for the fall of Afghan regime. So I think they'd be very careful. But UAE, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and maybe some in Central Asia, but I think Central Asians are going to be a bit more careful too. If I had to bet, yes, I think those would be the countries. But I think it's more likely that the countries are going to be coordinating and talking to each other. And although there may be some sort of countries who could go in earlier than the others, I think there'd be more or less a consensus established before there'd be a sort of rush of recognition. As I say, the roadmap would help that.
I have one more question before I turn to my audience here. Is that how could you see the role of Pakistan in the near future in terms of helping or assisting the unrecognized Taliban regime? After the fall of Kabul, I remember some news that there was even some clashes on the border between Pakistan and the now Taliban-ruled Afghanistan. The Talibs are stopped some of the trucks coming from Pakistan, claiming there are no rules or fees are paid.
Yeah, of course, the relationship is not so simple as Pakistan aiding Taliban. The Taliban is primarily Pashtun, and in Pakistan, the Pakistani Pashtuns are trying to become more independent. And so if Taliban were to assist those people, they would naturally be running against the Pakistani government. It's a sort of kind of existing bond which exists between the two countries. But for Pakistan, Afghanistan is considered in terms of its sort of strategic interest, particularly in view of its conflict with India. And so that would override the small differences, if you like. And I think Pakistan would try to help Taliban establish itself, because that's what Pakistan wanted, in terms of particularly helping the economic activities through trade and transit and other things. Pakistan could work with some other country in the region in the way of regional development. So I believe that Pakistan would be able to help Taliban come to see senses and compromise in the future. Pakistan obviously understands what is necessary for Taliban to do in order to be recognized. It's not a coincidence, I think, that the Foreign Minister Qureshi was the first person to suggest a roadmap for normalization of relationship with the Taliban. So I believe that Pakistan would play a key role in the future, although they will be extra careful not to be seen to be equated with the Taliban's interest.
Thank you. We have one last question then, which is partly reflects on your previous thoughts on the inclusiveness of the government. The question goes like, is an inclusive government or political leadership is a realistic aim? Is it really achievable?
Yes, I think so. You know, when we look at many of our own countries' system, how is inclusivity being achieved? And there are many, many ways. One easiest way is parliament. But of course, Taliban may not accept parliament because they are opposed to elections. You know, they want to sort of appoint people to political positions rather than to elect people to political positions. And this is something that I argued a lot with the Taliban, by the way. They never accepted elections. So parliament may be difficult, but some kind of entity which would reflect various interests, regional interests, political groups' interests. If you like, you know, kind of maybe smaller loya jirga to be established. That's one way, even though the members may not be elected, but you know, if they could be representative enough, that's one way. The other, which is less effective, is, for instance, like in other countries where you have the sort of council of elder statesmen or leadership council, where the government takes advice and where the various interests of political differences are reflected and represented. So, you know, one could be imaginative and think of the way in which inclusivity can be attained without not necessarily by having ministers to be distributed among all political groups.
Thank you. I'm just thinking about while you were giving this answer that the Western community somehow accepted the loya jirga as a kind of institution since, as I remember, President Hamid Karzai first was elected by the emergency loya jirga. At the time, that was the way which provided the first legitimacy to former President Karzai.
Yes.
Ambassador Yamamoto, thank you again for your presence here and your reflections on Afghanistan. I really enjoyed this talk, and I hope our audience enjoyed as much as I. thank you for again your presence here, and I thank for the audience for the presence and the questions they asked. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed. Thank you so much. Bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you,
Bye.
Peter. Bye.